Well, a big hearty welcome to each of you from Alexander and Haberman. We are very proud to be hosting our Spring 2022 Speaker Series. Today is the second of 4 in this series. In February, we did a workshop on a reverse mortgage Cinderella story. In April, we'll have a workshop on understanding annuities, and in May, we'll be learning about estate planning. Any of this series or our previous series are available by request using the chat feature or by sending an email to workshops@mnhealthagents.com. Today's presentation, Aging Loved Ones, What Are Your Options?, is presented by Brad Johnson, owner of Oasis Senior Advisors here in Minnesota. He is a senior housing expert. His free service to seniors and their loved ones provides you with the assistance you need to find the next place to call home. Through what can often be a very stressful and difficult time, he will come alongside you and walk with you throughout the entire process, helping you assess your needs, your wants, and then matching them with the community that best provides the fit. As always, Alexander and Haberman does not practice or hold license in any of the specialties of our speakers, but welcomes them here to speak for the educational benefit of our clients, friends, and guests. Alexander and Haberman is a specialty firm focused on assisting with Medicare Advantage, supplements, and Part D plans, as well as individual and family health insurance on or off exchange, and group benefits, including health, dental, vision, and disability. As we get started, I want to say how great it is to be here again, and a special thanks to all of our staff who make this possible, including Caleb and Aaron, who are running our technology, as well as Brittany, Christian, Zena, Jackie, Nicole, and Beth. I want to extend a special welcome to those of you who are seeing us for the first time, and especially to those who may have invited you. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen and send them to host and panelists. We will respond to them at the end of the presentation. This will also allow anyone who needs to leave at 3 o'clock to hear the entire presentation. The Q&A time may extend beyond 3 p.m. So, to get us started with today's presentation, let me introduce Brad Johnson.
Thank you, Josh, for that warm welcome. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak with clients and friends of Alexander and Haberman. So today I'm going to talk about a topic that I call a generational issue. And this is speaking in terms of family life. And aging loved ones, it could be your spouse, it could be your parents, it could be your grandparents, neighbors, aunts, uncles, anyone who's in those senior years where living at home independently is becoming no longer such a viable option, and that presents a very challenging transition for families. And we'll run the kind of full range around how this impacts families and the dynamics in families, also get into financial impacts, and then talk about solutions. So before I get into that, I would like to talk about Oasis Senior Advisors and who we are. We're a national franchise organization that started in 2014. It's based in Bonita Springs, Florida, and has 106 franchise organizations or locations in 34 states. And what we do is we help seniors and their families make the transition from independent living to assisted living memory care. It's a free personalized assistance to streamline and simplify a complicated set of options. And if necessary, we can provide a resource for other key local services. Let me start too with my family's biographical background. Is it advancing? It's advancing here, but not there. Okay.
I apologize. 1 second, guys. We're just having one of those.
Sorry about this. We're straightening things out here so that what I'm seeing lines up with what you're seeing. Okay. There we go. And then use the clicker. Okay, so I spoke about this already, so I won't go over it again. And let me also talk about, just give you a little bit of my family background. And this is how I got into this work. So my mom had dementia, Alzheimer's, for 15 years, starting in 2002 until she passed in 2017. And in that time, I helped my parents go through a number of different transitions. The first one was when my dad was hospitalized with a brain bleed. We thought we were going to lose him, but he made it back. And then we realized Mom couldn't go back to the apartment by herself. And so we quickly got a respite arrangement and assisted living, and then they were able to go back home. And they did well for the next 5 years, but it was starting to break down a little bit. And you'll see again, and this is kind of a recurring theme of a trigger point for changes, but my mom was hospitalized. And that eventually led to my parents choosing to live in assisted living. And then 3 years later, my mom was in memory care. And it was at that point when my mom was in memory care that we had chosen one community, and I hadn't really thought about what happens if she outlives her resources. And I was talking with a friend of the family who does this work that I'm doing, and that's when I learned about a program called Elderly Waiver, which I'll talk about later in this presentation. But we ended up moving my mom to a different community. Now, she didn't live long enough to need it, but it gave me a lot of comfort knowing that she was in a place that she could live for the rest of her life. Then my dad went through it again just last year or two, and he was living independently, but things were going downhill. And then again, he was hospitalized and then spent the last 9 or 10 months of his life in a care suite. So I've lived this. Going back in 2017, I left the corporate world. I had been working in health insurance. I was at United Health Group for 8 years. And at the time, I thought I'd like to try something different. And I always liked the idea of owning my own business. And so as I was in that discernment phase, it was this experience that I had helping my family and how hard it is for families that made me think I'd like to do something here and at least share what my experience has been. And so I discovered Oasis Senior Advisors. It's a franchise organization. I bought the business, and 4 years later, here I am having the chance to speak with you. All right, so just a little bit of an overview of the senior housing market. In the United States, you've probably heard this statistic, there are 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day, and that's going to continue on for probably another, 7 or 8 years. Here in Minnesota, there are already 800,000 adults age 65 or over, and in, 15 years, that's going to be 1.3 million. Now, 78% of seniors own their own homes, and for many, this is their primary asset. And then the median income for seniors is $47,000. Typically, that's a combination of Social Security and a pension. But for many seniors, Social Security is it, 30%. So we can't really ask a question and get feedback here, but I'll ask it. So in the Twin Cities, there are over 250 assisted living memory care communities. So think 3 or 4 story brick and mortar buildings, and there's at least 10 new ones opening each year. Now, true or false? All communities are full with long wait lists. Because a lot of clients that I talk with in that first conversation have that perception. And like so many things, the answer is it depends. For the very popular communities, there are wait lists. And so if you want one of those, then it's a good idea to get started. But on others, we can always find an opening. And I have some clients where it's a very urgent situation where we need to find something in 2 weeks, and I'm always able to help them. So this presentation, for the most part, is written from the perspective of the adult child. And that's generally who I hear from when I get that phone call for help. But I think it works for everybody. But this is to help people my age understand, why do my parents feel so strongly about staying in their home? And I have a few reasons here. So attachment. People have lived in their home for decades, and they love it. And they just want to live there forever. A common thing I hear for people that feel that way is, I'm leaving out here feet first. And kind of imagining a very peaceful, they'll pass in their sleep, and that'll be the way it goes, which that happens in a small percentage, but for everybody else, it doesn't quite go that way. The work of moving. Selling a house and downsizing as you're older and maybe you have less energy and you've accumulated all these things is really hard. And that can create inertia. Independence. A lot of people equate moving with giving that up, which isn't really true, because if you do it soon enough, you choose where you're going to live, and you continue to make your choices. Perception. I've had people in their 90s just say, I'm not that old. And the average age in communities might be somewhere in the 80s. And then the old paradigm. I know I can relate to this. My grandparents, my two grandmas lived in a nursing home, the same one actually, it was kind of in the mid-80s. And I visited them, but I didn't enjoy it. It didn't smell very good. There were two people to the room. It just felt like a very bleak place. And so a lot of people, again, this is a generational thing. If that's their last memory of what this was, you can understand why they're hesitant to make that change. Well, a lot's changed in those decades, and assisted living has become a bigger part of the story, and the whole environment and setting is, I think, much nicer. And then finally, affordability. That this is more costly. There's often a perception that living at home is free, although maybe if that home needs repairs, maybe if somebody's having care needs and they have to bring in home health care, then the costs start to become more equal. And in some cases, as we'll get to later, living at home is actually a lot more expensive. So then when seniors finally decide to move to a senior living community, what are some of the reasons? And this top one is absolutely the one that I see that triggers a change. And it's a change in health for the individual or their spouse. It may be that they had a fall is a common one, and then a hospitalization, and they've maybe a 20-day stay in a transitional care unit. I'll be calling that TCU, and I think I referred to it that earlier. That used to be called rehab. Or maybe a change in the cognitive impairment of a spouse. And it just gets to a certain point where living at home is too hard for the caregiver, or too unsafe if somebody doesn't have a spouse. The next one is freedom from home maintenance responsibilities, or just the business of running a house. And that's especially true here. We're in March, spring is finally here, but it's been a hard winter, and I think people, they're worried about ice and shoveling walks and maybe breaking down furnaces and that kind of stuff. And a lot of people just say it's time to move on and simplify my life. The next one, desire for peace of mind and security. These are for the planners out there, people that have financial planners, they've worked with lawyers, they're thinking ahead, years ahead, and they like the idea of just having this taken care of and not leaving it to their children to have to sort out in a crisis. The fourth one, those of us who have worked with our parents trying to encourage them to make a change would probably be disappointed that we're in fourth place here, but you have the kids and others trying to help the parents understand, and we'll get into this whole family dialogue in a slide or two. And then the last, and I think this is underappreciated, but it's a desire for social interaction, especially as people age, and as my dad would say when he was in his late 80s, early 90s, that as he went to one funeral after another, he just felt like he was the last person of his generation left on earth. And then I saw when he made a move after my mom passed into a congregate living situation, he started having dinner with these 5 other widowers, and he had a new group of friends. And it really gave him kind of a new lease on life and a lot of enjoyment in those years that he lived there. The other thing on this one is COVID in particular has led to isolation for people. All right, now we're going to get directly to the adult child's perspective. And I talk about what I call a stress sandwich. So imagine somebody in their 50s maybe, their parents, they're concerned about the driving. I know I was with my parents. They look at their parents' living conditions and they start to feel uneasy about that. They see physical and mental decline. There's worries about finances. And then on the other side, they've got children, perhaps in high school or college, and challenges that come with being a parent. They're still working, and so they may be in demanding jobs that have limited time off, or the kind of job where you just you have to go to work. You don't have the liberty to not go to work and help out your parents in a crisis. And then the other one, which is this whole notion of family and sibling dynamics. And I think for a lot of people and their adult children, this one's catches them off guard a little bit because they've been living as sort of the heads of their own households, and they haven't had to worry too much about what their siblings think about much of anything. And then you get into this whole discussion about what to do with mom and dad and how to help them and what are the best choices. And it can be a challenging time for families, but also a very rewarding and enriching time as siblings work together with their parents to find a solution. All right, so let's talk about the family conversation. And so what is it? Well, it's the beginning of an extended discussion about the care for aging loved ones. Why it's important to build a common ground. Start to build a fact base. There's a lot of misunderstanding, misconceptions out there. And so to gather information, start to put a plan together. Ideally, both parents can be a part of it, although if one parent has dementia, that might be challenging and actually upsetting, so that might not be a good idea. And then all the children if possible. In-person's ideal. As we know, nonverbal communication is a large percentage of how we actually understand each other, and so it's important to not just hear the words that your parent says, but also see how they're saying them and what their emotion looks like. I've never heard of this as a one and done type conversation. It can take years, and it's just kind of an ongoing dialogue. And then ideally it's done in advance, and it's important to set aside time for it and not try to shoehorn it in to someone's birthday or some Christmas or Thanksgiving where people are gathering. We made that mistake with my parents a few times, and my dad was always very clever about changing the subject and getting back to the festivities. So anyway, it's important to set time aside for it. Then you get into this notion of family dynamics among siblings. And every family's different. Where it's simple but also really challenging is if someone is an only child, doesn't have any siblings, and they don't have to worry about this interaction, but they also have to shoulder the entire load of helping their parents by themselves. And whenever I have clients like that, I always let them know how much I admire and appreciate what they're doing for their parents or for their aunt or uncle. But where you do have a number of siblings, sometimes birth order comes into play. In many families, the default is the oldest daughter. But like in my case, we have one daughter in my family, and she lives in Iowa. And so I was the one that lived the closest to mom and dad, and so I ended up stepping up to it. It can be hard when one or more of the kids lives far away. Maybe they live in California or on the East Coast, and they've become kind of disconnected from the family, and then everyone's kind of plunged into this big topic, and then how to have them be engaged or not engaged. Some families like to split things up, where one sibling takes maybe the legal and financial stuff, another handles health care, going on doctor's appointments, another takes care of the things at home, and everyone helps with transportation. And if you do that, I think it's important to have a clear designation. And actually, if you go through the kind of the legal document process, that does kind of formalize it, where you have individuals identified as attorneys in fact, power of attorney, and also healthcare power of attorney. So then you get into the discussion itself, and what you want to do is understand what are the wishes of the parent and the children. And it would be great if everyone started on the same page, but it rarely happens, and there's going to be differences of opinion. If you find out that everybody's on the same page, then celebrate that, because it's not that common. I think just out of a matter of respect, let the parents go first, and listen really carefully to kind of what their concerns are, what their wishes are. I think this is true. Maybe it's an overgeneralization, but I think parents' priority, it's typically independence and self-determination and feeling like they're still in control of their lives. And most really want to stay in their homes forever, and that may not be the best or the least costly option, but I think a strategy where you stay in your home as long as you possibly can is certainly a good option. And then for adult children, they love their parents, but they have different priorities. They're concerned about the safety of their parent. They imagine that fall in the middle of the night, and then they're on the floor, and it may be later the next day or maybe more than that until help comes, because nobody knows. And then the other is just a desire to avoid that crisis that will force the need to drop everything. Because again, going back to that stress sandwich slide, for some adult children, they can't. They don't have the time or the ability to do that. All right, finances. I'll start with kind of that point on the upper right. A hard truth about this is senior care and senior housing is expensive. We've all become adults and basically learned how we need to live within our means. So what that means is our income exceeds our expenses. And when you get to this stage of life, it becomes so expensive that unless you're very wealthy, your expenses will exceed your income. It just happens. And that's a really hard transition for almost everybody to accept. In families, many families are very private when it comes to household finances. In fact, even between spouses, there can be real privacy. And so that can make this hard, because kind of this whole financial issue, which really what it boils down to is just a concern of what happens if my loved one outlives their resources. And that's a really important element to this, and it leads to kind of a fork in the road in terms of choosing communities. Money's emotional. As I mentioned, will I outlive my resources? Can I leave a legacy? I've been working hard all these years to accumulate something, and I want to leave it to my kids and help them have a little better life than maybe I had. Very hard to change a mindset. Our seniors right now grew up in the Depression for the most part, and that's they have a lifetime of that as part of what established their understanding of money early on. Really important for the parents and at least one of the kids to have a very candid, open understanding of finances so that the child can help the parent as they get into this step. The lower right is if resources are a concern, that is, if there's a risk that a loved one will outlive their resources, then it's important to choose a community that accepts what's called elderly waiver. And that's a Medicaid program that serves as a safety net to protect against that risk. And so if you're in a community that accepts elderly waiver, then when you reach that point, and you only qualify for it once you've run out of money, then you're in a place where, in theory, you can continue living there for the rest of your life. Unless maybe for health issues you have to move to skilled nursing, and then in that case it becomes medical assistance, which is the nursing home version of Medicaid. All right, so now we're at that point where more help is needed. Something needs to be brought in to help supplement the parent's situation or the loved one's situation. So staying at home, again, I think this is a great option for as long as you can. So then it's like, can mom and dad go home and be alone? This is especially important if maybe they're already widowed and they go through that hospitalization transition, and now there's kind of this question of can they go home or not. That's kind of like the key question that you'll ever find if your parent's in that transitional care unit in talking with the care team and the social workers. Or maybe mom or dad might move in with one of the kids. Could one of the kids come and stay with mom or dad? Or if none of that's possible, then could we hire a company or a home health agency to help out? And so on the right-hand slide, I show a little bit what those costs are. These are in today's dollars. Home health splits into two types. Companion care would be somebody to sit and keep someone company, maybe do housework, do the laundry, prepare meals. Where they draw the line between companion care and home health care is what we call personal care services. So think about help with taking a shower, or help with getting dressed in the morning, or getting undressed at night, or using the toilet, for example. They have different licensing, and so that's considered home health care, and you can see that it's more expensive. Even though you might only need somebody for an hour a day, most agencies have a minimum, let's say 2 or 3 hours, some are even greater than that. This is the least expensive option compared to assisted living if relatively little is needed. But if somebody is living at home and their care needs get to the point of 24/7 care, which is how things ended up for my father in the last year of his life, it's very expensive and can easily be over $20,000 a month. All right, so now maybe staying at home is no longer the best issue or best option. So what are the options in senior housing? And on the left, this really represents a continuum of care levels. And most assisted living or senior living communities that you'll see have at least that continuum of independent living, assisted living, and memory care. A more limited number have that higher level of assisted living called care suites or enhanced care. And I included skilled nursing here because it's very separate from assisted living, but it's kind of the final highest level of care for somebody. But going back to the top, so independent living, it basically is you rent an apartment, and I'd say virtually all of these are month-to-month leases. So, unlike in market rate apartments where you have year-long leases, these are month-to-month. And you rent an apartment, and that may be all you're doing. You're not taking any meals there. You're able to do your own cleaning and that kind of stuff. But you just want to be clear of the responsibility of owning a home. But you also like the idea of if your health changes, you're now in a place where you can get the care you need. And that's when assisted living comes in. And it's as you start to get help with the so-called activities of daily living, dressing, bathing, toileting, that kind of stuff, that's assisted living. And there used to be kind of a blurred continuum between the two, but there were some regulation changes in Minnesota that happened back in August of 2020, which really created a much clearer separation between those two. Memory care is for people with cognitive impairment. I think they might actually be calling it dementia care now. And what really distinguishes that from assisted living is it's a secure environment. And so one of the risks of people with cognitive impairment is something called wandering or exit-seeking behavior. And just to illustrate this, my mom, again, who had dementia, this would happen. My dad would go out and run some errands, and my mom she got to the point where that would make her anxious, and she would grab a suitcase and go down into the lobby by the front door, and the staff would say, "Jean, where are you going?" And she'd say, "Well, I'm going home to Mom and Dad." And then they'd help her back to her apartment. Or another time, she had gotten up before my dad, went out into the hall, their door locked as she was out in the hall. She went next door, that apartment door was open, and she went into a neighbor's apartment and lay down on the couch and went back to sleep. My dad woke up, my mom was gone, panic ensued, the Edina police were called, and it was everyone's worst nightmare. And then the neighbor woke up and said, "Oh, hi, Jean, what are you doing here?" And so all's well that ended well, but that was kind of the final thing, and we knew that Mom needed to be in a more secure environment at that point. And then care suites or enhanced care, what really distinguishes that from assisted living is a higher staffing level. Like, for example, that's what my dad was in his last year, and they had a 5-to-1 staffing ratio, which is about as high as you'll see in assisted living. And that's, again, and the other thing that sets it apart is the apartments are in closer proximity to the caregivers. So in theory, the caregivers are just steps away, and they can easily kind of check in on the residents throughout the day. And then that last one is skilled nursing, which is also known as the nursing home. And that's still an option out there. And for people that maybe are starting out in assisted living, the only reason you'd need to make that move to nursing care is if you've got some pretty serious health issues like sliding scale diabetes that requires sliding scale insulin, or maybe you have a feeding tube, or you have wound care, or something serious like that where you need nursing care. On the right, I've got an idea of pricing here. This is a range. Independent living, probably the least expensive I've seen it is around $1,600 for a 1-bedroom. The most expensive places can be upwards of around $3,500 to $4,000, and you see kind of down the line. And I think this is an important slide because it just gives you a sense of what to expect. And while almost everybody has sticker shock when they first see this. You realize as expensive as it is, it's just what it costs. And there's really no inexpensive way to do this. Costs are broken into two pieces, rent and care. Rent, those rates are generally published, and it's very easy to do an apples-to-apples comparison across communities. With cares, is the point I make at the bottom, there's a number of different ways that communities can establish the pricing for cares, which makes it really challenging to do an apples-to-apples comparison. But what I found is, for most residents, the costs end up being about the same for the care part across communities, because essentially what you're doing is paying for caregiver time. And if everyone's care plan is the same, then you can get there a lot of different ways, but it'll probably be pretty close to the same cost. So if you are in a position where you've got a loved one, where you're trying to explore these options, especially if you want to make a transition into senior housing with care, there are a number of ways to do it. You can do it yourself. Many people do this. And if you have time, it's fine. You could get a senior housing guide. Again, the 250 or so communities may make this feel overwhelming. But you simply just start making phone calls, and trying to reach out to communities. And I've got a few slides, 5 factors, which I think if you are going to do it yourself, that would be a good outline for you. There are also internet-based services. That abbreviation is a place for mom, a little different model. They'll do the intake interview, they'll send you some listings, and then you'll start getting phone calls from communities, is how I understand it. And then locally based services like myself, and there are a few others in town. And we live here, we work here, we are able to maybe meet in person if that's what somebody wants. We schedule the appointments, and we go along in the tours and basically be a resource as you navigate your way through this process. So how do I do it? How does my approach work? Well, I use a personalized process. On that first call, it's called an intake interview, and usually takes about half hour. Can go longer if we have a lot to talk about, and I'll get into the 5 key factors in the next slide. Once I know that, then I conduct research into the marketplace to identify communities that would be a good fit. Josh mentioned that in my intro. And then I come back with a short list of communities that I think would be a good fit, and I've kind of streamlined that process so you don't have to go see 15 or 20 places. And then I'll schedule the appointments, and as my schedule allows, go along on the tours. And if other services are needed, like let's say you need to work with an elder law attorney, or maybe you need help moving, I can provide suggestions for that. So the 5 factors. Timing. This can range from immediately, which in that situation where someone's hospitalized and they're in the transitional care unit, we might need to find something in 2 weeks. Or it might be, we need to make a move, but it doesn't have to happen right now, but it should happen in a few months, to somebody who's just starting out, maybe more at the younger, healthier, independent living end. And that can go on for a couple of years. Location. Should it be close to where the senior is currently living, or should they make a move and be closer to their children? And there's really no right answer here. I understand maybe a senior who's really active in their church, and that's a really important community to them. They want to stay close to that. But I do see, and I experience this with my parents, that as you get to those final stages of life, the last year, the last months, it's so important to be close to family and just to share that time together. And I guess I just feel sorry for people that are separated by hundreds or thousands of miles when they get to that stage. Care needs. And this is also about health issues and medical issues, but what is needed right now, and also what's important, what's going to be needed in the future. And this is really important for progressive conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because the arc of those diseases for each person is very different, but you know where it's going and sort of where it's going to end up. And so you need to choose a community that is going to be able to meet your needs throughout that whole phase, but especially toward the end as things get really challenging. Lifestyle. really important for couples, especially if one has dementia, the other doesn't, to find a community that meets both of their needs. Or it might be something like, I want to be in a place that's very lively and has a lot of stimulating kinds of activities, more of a, I call it the independent living energy. Or maybe you've got a religious affiliation that and we don't see that much in the Twin Cities, but there are some communities that are very tightly aligned with one religion or another. And then the last one is financial resources. And this one, as I said, kind of splits the list in half. So of those 250 communities in the Twin Cities, about half are what we call private pay only, which means you can live there as long as you can afford to live there. And if you get to the point where you outlive your resources, you'll likely have to move. And then the other half are what we call the accept elderly waiver. A typical approach might be they require residents to have at least 2 years worth of resources before they run out of money. And so for people that are very wealthy, or not very wealthy, but aren't at risk of outliving their resources, you can choose anywhere. But I know that's why I really like to understand the finances, because if someone's at risk of outliving their resources, I think it's really important to make the right choice. Why Oasis, or why Brad Johnson? So honest and unbiased. Even though, as you'll see, we're compensated by the communities, our focus is on finding the best solution for the client. So Josh mentions it's free, so you might be asking yourself, well, how's that possible? And that's made possible by, if you end up choosing a community that pays what's called a referral fee, then I get compensated. And most communities in the Twin Cities pay referral fees. Some don't. But a choice I made when I started doing this 4 years ago was, in order to do it right, I needed to consider all the communities and recommend the ones that were the best fit, regardless of whether or not they pay referral fees or not. And so very typically, my recommendations back are a mix of those two types. I don't tell my clients which is which. In an average year, I think about 10% of my clients end up choosing the one that didn't pay the fee, but that's okay. I've built that into my philosophy of doing this work. I'm a certified senior advisor. That's a designation, which I had to go through some training and background check and continuing education, that sort of thing. And then local knowledge to recommend additional services. And then if you have a loved one that maybe needs help in another city, I can connect you with colleagues of mine that work in other parts of the United States. So that's it. Thank you very much. I have really enjoyed this opportunity, and I understand we have some Q&A coming up.
We do. Thank you so much, Brad, for all of that amazing information. This is a very tough subject, and I know that it's not something that anyone looks forward to, but that having the right resources can make such a tremendous difference in people's experiences. Thank you. Do you want me to redo that? No? Super. So we do have a number of questions. Some of these are ones that we have heard in previous conversations we've had. Some of these are questions that you've put in live. I do want to emphasize the chat feature at the bottom, and if you can ask the host and panelists, then we'll be able to make sure these get integrated into our process and we're able to ask those questions of Brad. So if I can start out with this question. You talked a lot, Brad, about the different pricing. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to, in your experience visiting so many of these facilities, what is the difference that you see between a less expensive facility and a more expensive facility in the same category?
Well, I think the first one is sometimes it's the age of the building. And you can, some buildings just show their age, as you can expect of maybe a community that's been there for maybe 20 years or so. You also see it in the common spaces. So think of the dining rooms, and do they have movie theaters and workout facilities? I mean, some are literally like health clubs, and they've got, and a few even have swimming pools. And then in the finishes, it's like anything. If you go into someone's house, you can tell the difference of, how much money they spent decorating and finishing their house. But, it's so that's the visible. But ultimately, for I think most of us, especially as you get toward end of life, it's all about the care. And I believe that's where we, even though one place might be less expensive or more expensive from a rent standpoint, I think we see a lot of consistency in terms of the quality and level of care across those two different types.
Super, thank you. That was definitely something that had me wondering, because some of those ranges are just so wide. Of course, seeing those ranges, and perhaps for some of us the first time, how do normal people pay for this stuff?
Well, that's a good question. The first layer of how you pay for it is your income. Instead of paying for your expenses at home and everything else, that then is sort of goes to the community, because that's the roof over your head and the food that you're eating. And then also dipping into savings. If you're a veteran, there are some benefits, pension benefits through the VA that you'd want to explore. One that I'm always excited to see is if somebody has long-term care insurance, and those policies can really range from, it feels like the older ones are pretty rich with almost unlimited benefits, and then the more recently sold ones are still good, but they've got some limits to them. But it's really, I think of it as layers of funding sources. And then if you get to that point where you've depleted your resources, then that's where this elderly waiver program comes in.
Super. So you're actually anticipating our next two questions from the audience. So I want to kind of compliment you on that. You mentioned long-term care in that most recent answer, right? I mean, what does that do to the experience of the clients that you work with that have that? Do you feel like the clients that you work with that don't have that are missing out on something essential? Do you feel like they're getting a less satisfactory experience?
Well, that's an interesting take on it. I think the one thing that long-term care insurance does is I think it provides a peace of mind that there's a funding source that will help that individual get to sort of pay for their care, for the remainder of their life. This whole private pay versus communities that accept elderly waiver, this really varies in the Twin Cities. And I think I finally figured out that it sort of follows socioeconomic zip codes. And so there are patches of the Twin Cities where all the places are private pay only. And then there are others where it's a mix, and others where they all accept elderly waiver. And so to get to your question, if somebody really wants to live in a certain part of the Twin Cities that's maybe close to where they've been living or where their kids are, and they have that long-term care benefit, then they can probably live wherever they want to and not have that restriction.
Super. You also spoke about elderly waiver, and increasingly as I talk to people about this, it just seems to be a bigger and bigger can of worms. Where do people go to learn more about that? Is that something that you can provide information on, or are there other great resources if people think that elderly waiver may be in their or a loved one's future?
Yeah, that's a good question. So elderly waiver, because I needed to learn about it myself for my parents, and then as I started doing this work, and what I found was if you go online, it's very hard to find descriptions of what this program is written in layperson's language. You can find very detailed, almost like legislative, regulatory written descriptions. The state of Minnesota now does have a piece that they put online that does a pretty good job. And whenever I get calls from people where they need to know this, I send that link to them, and maybe we can make that link available too as part of this.
That'd be great.
Yeah. But just in a nutshell, and I've had people misunderstand. They think, well, if I'm going to do that, then the state takes all my money, right? And it doesn't work that way. You only qualify for elderly waiver once you've run out of money. So you may not live long enough for that to happen. And so you get to that point, by the letter of it, it's when your resources are $3,000 or less for an individual. For couples, it's more complicated. But if you're in senior housing with care, when you're getting close to $3,000, that'll be gone in a month. So actually what you need to do is start the application process probably 4 months earlier. Now, Medicaid is a federally funded program. Each state sets their own policy for it. Minnesota, from what I understand, has a pretty strong program for seniors, and then it's administered at the county level. So that's where your application process happens. It's in your own community.
So that clearly a can of worms, and I appreciate your sharing that with us.
I have one more point to make on that one that I forgot about. Yeah. So if you have, it's kind of complicated, especially for couples. And I would say, for people that, there are people that are so wealthy that they will never worry about this, and so you don't need to really understand it. There are others who, they will outlive their resources, and so they need to understand it. And then there are others who are kind of in that middle. And I would say, I really strongly advise talking to an elder law attorney and understanding this, because you can make choices of how you handle your assets that could, in sort of hindsight down the road, be a mistake. And you want to be careful not to make those mistakes.
Well, thank you, and perhaps that's an idea for a future speaker for our series. If you guys would like to hear more about that, please put that in the chat, and after we post this online, you can also ask that question or emphasize that point in the comments down below. A question that we have seen come up a couple different times, right, is there's some appreciation for the advice you've provided on the conversation that we should have with our parents, but the question that comes up quite a few times is when? How do I initiate this?
That really depends family by family. I think if your parents or parent, if they're in their 70s and they're healthy and really living a pretty vibrant, active lifestyle, maybe not necessary. But I think once your parents or loved ones get into their 80s, and now the difference there would be if there's some underlying health issue, like cognitive impairment or Parkinson's or something that's happening, unfortunately, in their 70s or even earlier, then absolutely it's time to start talking about it. But what I found is that, and my parents really taught me this, that as they got into their 80s, all of a sudden things started happening, and they started losing like spouses of friends, and just this realization that life is a little more unpredictable when it comes to our health as we get into that stage. And then I'd say for sure, if you're lucky enough to have parents that are still living in their 90s, you'll want to start this conversation for sure.
Super. So you must have talked to a lot of people, Brad, and sometimes perhaps it's too late for you to help them, and in other cases you may have helped them and then you stay in contact over time. Are there some common mistakes that you've seen people make that you could counsel us today to perhaps help us avoid?
Well, it's one that I made myself. So I was helping my parents, and I had this mindset like, well, every place is full, isn't it? And so I picked the first place that was recommended, and they happened to be a newly opened building, so they still had openings. And my mom moved into memory care, and by that point, I had created this cash flow model for my parents, which basically helped me answer the question, how long is the money going to last? And that was helpful, and I share it with my clients because it might mean you have to sell the family cabin or something like that. But what I saw was, because my mom was probably in her, let's say she was 80 or in her early 80s, and her mom lived to be 95. And so we have longevity in my family. And so it wasn't hard to imagine that my mom could outlive those resources. And that's when I learned about elderly waiver, and then realized that it never occurred to me, because I didn't know anything about it, to ask about it. And so then I went and spoke with the executive director at that community and learned that no, they didn't offer elderly waiver for people that were in memory care. And it was based on that we then moved my mom to a place that did. So I think that's a big one, because I get client referrals where they chose a private pay only community, and then their resources started dwindling, and then they've kind of realized what's happening, and then I get that referral call. And hopefully if they still have a bit of a nest egg where they could pay for 2 years or something, we can find a good solution for them. Other than that, I think I've had another one. I don't know how often this happens, but I think people, in the interest of saving money, think, well, let's find a place out, in a small town, like 100 or 150 miles away from the Twin Cities. Okay, that's a good idea, but now you've got to drive 3 hours to see your mom or dad. And again, as they get older and the need to have family around, I just think in that case, you're probably going to end up moving them back to the Twin Cities.
That's an interesting point for you to end on, Brad, because we had another audience question describing a situation that I'm guessing is pretty common these days, where the kids have moved away from the parents. I know in my wife's family, some of the kids moved to California, others to Chicago, right? When you've got a family that's spread all over the country, how do you go about starting the conversations and making the choices about care when people are so far apart?
That's a very challenging situation, and there's really no right answer. But I do see the situation where eventually the senior just realizes, I'm getting into a pretty vulnerable stage of my life, and while I've really enjoyed living in this community, where maybe they've lived for decades, what they realize is they really aren't that connected to it anymore. Maybe they're not able to go to church because they physically can't do it, or their close friends maybe have moved on or are no longer there. So they kind of get to the point where they realize, okay, this reason I had for staying here maybe isn't so important anymore. And then they make a move. In some cases, the children move to the parents. I don't see that very often, but you can still do this anyway. And I think, I've actually had it where parents who live in one city and their kids are in another, a lot of times they're the ones that are planning ahead. They realize, I want to be in a place where if something happens, we've already figured all this out, and we're not having to sell a house, and we're not having to start from zero, and it's just a matter of adding care to my living arrangement.
Well, thank you for that. That's definitely a perspective that I think is going to be impacting a lot of families as they're trying to think about what to do. We are nearing the end of the questions. If there anyone else in the audience who would like to get in a question, I'd just like to put in one last plug for the chat feature at the bottom and using the selecting host and panelist to send that question in. If we don't get any more after this next question, we will wrap things up. But we do have one more question at this point, and that's this. From an audience member, my dad is becoming physical, and he gets confused. And sometimes he's getting physical when he's confused. Is placement harder in these circumstances? Any guidance you can give me?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that that's happening in your family, because that is challenging. It does make placement more challenging, and the euphemistic term for when somebody is getting physical is they talk about behaviors, and that if somebody has dementia and they have behaviors, and there are, fortunately there are some memory care communities that specialize in memory care that they know, they understand this, and they have training, and they have kind of living settings that are able to have someone who has some challenging behaviors live there. But unfortunately, there are a number of memory care communities where they just understand it's kind of a fragile chemistry with the residents. And in some cases, there may only be like 12 or 16 residents. And if one resident has some physical behaviors, that's hard for the other residents. The family members of other residents are concerned about that. So again, I'm sorry that that's happened, but there are solutions for that situation. And if you want to reach out to me and we can talk about it offline, I'd be happy to see if I have any ideas for you.
That's fantastic, Brad. What a great presentation. A ton of information. My guess is there are other questions that will come up for people at some point. Don't hesitate to reach out to us with those questions. If you've got Brad's information, you can reach out directly to Brad. But I do want to wrap things up for today. So thank you to everyone for attending Alexander and Haberman's Spring 2022 Speaker Series and today's presentation, Aging Loved Ones, What Are Your Options? Thank you very much, Brad.
Thank you, Josh.
We really appreciate that and all the expertise you bring to us as owner of Oasis Senior Advisors right here in Minnesota. Also want to thank Caleb and Aaron, who are running our technology, as well as Brittany, Christian, Zena, Jackie, Nicole, and Beth. Alexander & Haberman is a specialty firm focused on assisting with Medicare Advantage, supplements, and Part D plans, as well as individual and family health insurance on and off exchange, as well as group benefits, including health, dental, vision, and disability.